Hello, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. On the eve of the talks in Berlin, where the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, will communicate with American representatives alongside European leaders, the Ukrainian leader emphasized that any plan that will be adopted during these talks will not please everyone, just like any settlement recipes that involve compromise. Zelenskyy reported that the United States' proposal regarding Donbas is for Ukrainian troops to leave the part of the territory of the Donetsk region that they currently control, and for Russian troops not to occupy this territory. We know that Russia continues to insist on the withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from the Donetsk region almost as a main condition, which, if met, will continue the negotiations on a ceasefire. However, assistant to the President of the Russian Federation, Yuri Ushakov, commenting on the American proposals regarding the non-introduction of Russian troops into the territory of the Donetsk region, has already said that the troops may not be there, but there may be parts of the Russian National Guard, which, in principle, is not really different from the control of the regular Russian army and will allow the Russians to carry out a methodical cleansing of the region from all those who will consider themselves citizens of Ukraine and will be against the Russians controlling the part of Donetsk not occupied by them through war. Zelenskyy, however, is not confident that the Trump plan will necessarily work and emphasized that if its implementation fails, it will be necessary to go another way. And this assessment by the President of Ukraine differs somewhat from the optimistic assurances that we are closer to ending the war today than ever. I generally always have a question when both Zelenskyy and the leaders of European countries make such statements: what are they actually motivated by? Perhaps the heads of state have information that you and I do not have, including about the real state of the Russian economy, which is carefully hidden by the Kremlin. And then they can really believe that Putin may agree to some compromises with Donald Trump simply to prevent the final ruin of his own country's economy, which may eventually lead to the collapse of the Chekist regime. Or perhaps this is not related at all to any information about the state of the Russian economy or the state of the Russian army, but is instead connected exclusively with the desire to please the American President Donald Trump in order to reduce the danger of the United States refusing further participation in the settlement of the Russian-Ukrainian war. To reduce the danger of Washington refusing to exchange intelligence information with the Ukrainian armed forces, refusing to sell American weapons to the Ukrainian defense forces for European money. And then, of course, when European leaders say that peace is very close, and when Zelenskyy talks about it, they are thus honoring the efforts of President Donald Trump and his team, aimed at finding compromises that should end the Russian-Ukrainian war. But the most important thing here, in this position, is to find the culprit in the fact that the Trump plan did not end with any real result. And of course, the Kremlin is interested in Zelenskyy and European leaders being the culprits. It is not surprising that Russian officials constantly criticize with such harshness not only the Ukrainian leadership but also our European friends. And in Ukraine and Europe, of course, they are interested in Trump putting the blame for the next disruption of his peace efforts precisely on the President of Russia, Putin. Especially since you and I see that Trump has never had a particular desire to put the blame for what is happening on Putin, and perhaps he never will, but he is simply forced to do so under the pressure of obvious facts of the Russian political leadership's unwillingness to agree to similar compromises. Well, now, at the meeting that is to take place in Berlin, primarily the American, Ukrainian, and European positions will be agreed upon, but not the Russian one. And the question arises, even if O'Brien, or whoever else from the American officials will also be present at this meeting, agrees on some compromise borders with the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and our European friends, to what extent are they really ready to talk about these compromises in the Russian capital? Especially when we see that Putin's main effort is not so much to achieve real peace as to maximally drag out time for the continuation of the Russian-Ukrainian war and the ruin of Ukraine. We perfectly understand that if Putin really considered ending the war at some stage, he would not make such efforts, say, to completely destroy the infrastructure of the south of our country, to make life in Odessa or Mykolaiv unbearable. And we see that the Russian army is making considerable efforts for this, which cannot even be compared with the efforts in the zone of military operations. This in no way speaks of Putin's peacefulness. But at the same time, we understand that Putin also has another very important point that he is forced to reckon with. Putin does not want a serious conflict with Donald Trump because he realizes that the American president, if he is indeed ready for decisive actions against Russia and will accuse Putin of interfering with his peace plans, still has quite a few real opportunities to create problems for the Russian economy. Well, even now the so-called secondary sanctions are not yet in effect against the countries that are sponsors of the Russian economy, which continue to buy Russian oil despite the new American sanctions. And the Americans have many opportunities to introduce sanctions against these countries. They have many opportunities to control what is happening with the Russian shadow fleet. What's more, the Americans are already doing this when they are actually turning a blind eye to the destruction of the Russian shadow fleet's tankers by the Ukrainian armed forces. What's more, as far as we understand, the Americans are providing the Ukrainian armed forces with corresponding intelligence information that facilitates the destruction of these ships, and thus can create not only problems with the delivery of oil to buyers. It can create an unwillingness in these buyers to purchase this oil so as not to face the risks of non-delivery of the goods and thus a deficit of their own capabilities at oil refineries. That is, the United States has quite a few real opportunities, and Putin will have to choose in any case between his obvious desire to continue the war of attrition and the obvious desire to not quarrel with the United States and drag out time so as not to run into sanctions of a new order. But where Zelenskyy is right, perhaps after the next failure of the Trump plan, it will be necessary to look for another way to continue and end the Russian-Ukrainian war. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social media, to the channels on Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, and Donatella, which help develop these resources. Use the sponsorship function on YouTube itself. Victory and peace to you. Good luck.